As Halloween nears, our thoughts may turn to a wide variety of monsters, but a popular category is revenants, the dead reanimating and coming back to torment the living. Ideas of these terrifying creatures have been around for many centuries and in lots of different cultural contexts. The term vampire, referring to people rising from the dead and drinking the blood of the living, is a pretty popular theme in Hollywood movies. They generally channel the likes of Dracula and the vampires associated with Eastern Europe. What can anthropologists tell us about vampires? Well, the short answer is a lot. Forensic anthropologist Katie Waterhouse will get us started by highlighting some of the familiar visuals associated with vampires.
What does biological anthropology tell us about vampires? Well, it can tell us something about the imagery that we see with vampires, because within biological anthropology, we have to understand the decomposition of human remains. First up, vampire hunters often talk about vampires as being really fleshy, and this comes from bloat. After we die, the bacteria inside our gut starts to decompose our tissue, and in doing so, they start to release a lot of gases, and that makes our bodies bloat and swell up so we can look a lot fleshier in death than we did in life. Then, the idea that vampires have the soft, smooth, supple skin. This comes from skin slippage. After death, the layer between our skin and the tissue underneath decomposes away, and our skin literally slips off and slides off our body, exposing the soft, delicate tissues underneath, creating this image of a smooth, young, supple skin. Then we have that concept that vampires have really long nails and really long teeth. And no, this isn't nails and teeth growing after death, but rather the tissues around the nails and the teeth shrinking away as they dehydrate, which makes the nails and the teeth look much, much larger and much, much longer as the tissues shrink back from the teeth and the nails. And finally, we have the image of the vampire's red mouth. This comes from expulsion. During the bloat stage of decomposition, the body fills with the digestive products of the bacteria, and that has to release somewhere. And it usually does so through some orifice in the body, such as the mouth or the eyes, leaving this red or dark staining around the mouth, which could be taken as the red mouth of a vampire.
Some of these aspects of decomposition, which can be interpreted as the deceased actually being undead, can reveal themselves before the burial, leading to the determination that the individual is in fact a vampire. Take the release of gases, for example, created as microbes digest body tissues. These can be expelled in embarrassing ways, particularly at a funeral. This is one of the reasons why many demand to be embalmed. This may be the explanation behind this grave from the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea. Dating to the 1850s, the grave is completely different from others in the churchyard. It's surrounded by heavy chains. The story goes that the corpse groaned or coughed during the wake, leading people to conclude that the individual was a vampire. But what about the other aspects of decomposition that Katie is talking about? Wouldn't individuals be buried by the time these processes could be observed? For the most part, yes. In the case of Europe, though, in the 16th and 17th century, many of these communities were gripped by various episodes of plague. This invisible terror descended upon communities, leading to mass death and a real need to try to explain the source of this disease. This invisible and poorly understood villain descended on communities and often led to mass death. This not only begged for explanations and folk solutions, but it also created opportunities for gravediggers to inadvertently disturb bodies as they re-excavated in graveyards to make room for still more victims, creating opportunities to witness these gruesome decomposition details. I'm an archaeologist, and I'm interested in the material evidence to help us think about vampires in a medieval European context. There are many examples of vampire graves that have been excavated over the last many decades. While the solutions for addressing the undead vary, they all have a common theme: attempting to keep the dead down and keep them from reanimating and emerging from the grave to wreak havoc on the living. A well-known example would be this one, excavated in Venice, where a brick was inserted into a woman's mouth, apparently after the initial burial. In other cases, rituals appear to have been performed at the time of burial. What this would suggest is that there would be this understanding before burial that these individuals were dangerous, were in fact vampires, and that particular rites would need to be performed. Some people suggest that people were labeled as deviants for a variety of reasons. Maybe they were labeled as pagans or witches. Sometimes it might have been because they were unbaptized or died because of suicide. In any case, these individuals were suspected of being vampires and treated accordingly in death. In vampire graves excavated in Poland, we see sickles across the neck or abdomen, or a rock weighing down the throat. In more than 100 vampire burials that have been identified in Bulgaria, it is common to see an iron spike driven through the rib cage, presumably aiming for the heart. This method of vampire disposal has become pretty common in folklore and in Hollywood pop culture. In another example, people who buried a middle-aged man must have been particularly fearful that he would reanimate and terrorize. His chest was weighted down with a heavy iron plowshare, and there was the added precaution of amputating his left leg after death and burying it beside the body. This would make it particularly difficult for him to reanimate and walk amongst the living. The social meanings and contexts of vampires cross-culturally, both in time and space, are generally much more serious than our humorous Halloween depictions. The social rearrangement that occurred in response to European colonization in many different parts of the world occurred on a massive scale. The cultural reckoning to make sense of this oppression and exploitation, the reactions and explanations to these experiences took many forms, but interestingly, often they are explained in the form of monsters, as revenants. Cultural anthropologist Tara Tudor explains two such vampires, the Wazimamoto of Kenya and the Manananggal of the Philippines.
Cross-culturally, vampires are a very common type of monster. Vampires have some similarities. Vampires are always nocturnal. Vampires prey on humans, and vampires, for the most part, depend on blood for their sustenance, although there are some exceptions there too. As anthropologists, we're interested in looking at both the similarities and the differences in vampires in different parts of the world. When it comes to understanding the specifics of each vampire, we want to understand their meaning, their symbols, in terms of the specific historical, political, and social context in which they exist. The Wazimamoto is a vampire that dates back to the 1800s and into the 1900s in Kenya. And the Wazimamoto appears as a male. The Wazimamoto usually wears some kind of uniform, and the Wazimamoto is associated with firemen. In fact, the direct translation of this word is he who puts out fire or heat. Now, the Wazimamoto is not only conceptualized as male and one who wears a uniform, but one who very often carries a rubber hose. And it's using this rubber hose that the Wazimamoto is able to extract blood from his victims. In some stories, the Wazimamoto visits people in their homes at night and is able to extract their blood without them ever waking up. In other cases, he might put a cloth over their mouth, and this prevents them from being able to cry out, and he then forcibly takes their blood. Sometimes the victims die, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there are stories of cars coming to pick up victims. In these cases, it's thought that the victims are taken away to the fire station or elsewhere in these cars, and their blood is used to create medicine to treat European diseases. Now the Manananggal comes from the Philippines, and the Manananggal is female, not male, and doesn't have a foreigner's appearance. However, the Manananggal is one of the most frightening vampires, and that's because the Manananggal is able to separate her upper body from her lower body. And the Manananggal has a long, long tongue. She has wings, and she flies around at night, and she looks for victims. And very often her victims are pregnant women. So the Manananggal is thought to use her long tongue to extract people's innards and possibly even fetuses, whether putting her tongue through the throat or putting her tongue through the belly button. She's able to extract and feed on our innards and possibly even our fetuses. The characteristics of the Manananggal, that she is a woman rather than a man, that she detaches her body and particularly preys on pregnant women, is thought to be explained by the colonial period in the Philippines when the Spanish occupied these areas and started to introduce Catholicism. Catholicism in which women had a very specific role to play within the society, and it wasn't one of leadership. This is completely counter to indigenous Filipino society in which women and men shared power. So the aswang and the idea of monsters and demons predates Spanish colonization, but the specifics of the Manananggal seem to coincide with Spanish colonization. It's thought that this myth of the Manananggal was used by the Spanish as a way to disempower women by making women who were healers and specifically midwives seen as evil and to be potential predators of the local population.
So what is clear is that our monsters are symbolically meaningful. These overt fears can represent substantial social components that are associated with things like power, colonialism, religion, and gender. Lots to think about as you prepare for some Halloween fun.